Please look at the pictures on slide 3 of the Google Slides presentation. These are the etchings from a women's etiquette book illustrating the expected and permissible clothing for women. Notice how elaborately these women are dressed and how cumbersome and impractical their bathing suits are. It's important to understand that swimming for women at this time really just meant going into the water a bit and getting wet, not the actual act of swimming laps or partaking in the physically challenging act that we all engage in when we jump into a pool today. The chief concerns of these women was to keep as much of their keep as much of their bodies covered as possible so as to not darken and therefore damage their skin and to prevent their modesty. Sorry, not to prevent, to preserve, to preserve their modesty, which explains the style for their bathing suits and the fact that they're not showing a lot of skin. Moving on to the next section, section 3, contrasting cultures. Creole society versus Edna Pontellier's Kentucky Presbyterian upbringing. If we take a look at this section, so first, Kentucky Presbyterians. Just some notes about them in general. They were severe Calvinists in their upbringing. So Calvinists were people who believed that your sole reason for being on the earth was to do God's work, not to enjoy yourself. So work came before pleasure and enjoyment. Note the behavior of Edna's father when he comes to visit. This is a typical example of what we would call puritanical sternness, being very serious all the time. Kentucky Presbyterians were very patriarchal, meaning that the husband or the father was the head of the family and was the one who made all the decisions. Southern Presbyterians were conservative, meaning they were not open to other ideas or modernizing things. They believed that the way things worked in the past were the way things should continue to work moving forward. Lastly, their philosophy can be summed up in the adage or the saying, life is, quote, serious business. You were allowed to enjoy yourself and to have fun, etc., once you demonstrated to your higher power or your God that you had done the work that they expected you to do while you were on earth. So there was no real time or dedicated, how to say this, there was no way for you to really enjoy yourself if you were supposed to be getting work done. So it was common that people would sacrifice their enjoyment and leisure time to do work instead. The French Catholics, on the other hand, were very different. First, they were very sophisticated, notably hostile towards what they would call backwards Americans, who seemed crude, dirty, and socially backward. They would have characterized the Presbyterians as crude, dirty, and socially backward because they worked for a living. Creoles played as hard as they worked. Instead of sacrificing one for the other, like the Kentucky Presbyterians did, Creoles believed that they could work very hard during the day, but then they also made it part of their culture to play very hard, especially in the evenings. Social freedoms for Creoles and the French Catholics were extended even to women. Women drank wine, enjoyed music and literature. They wore bright colors. They were well educated, and many were accomplished musicians and painters. Concubinage with a quadroon, which was a person who is a quarter black, or an octoroon, who is a person who is an eighth black, women, was normal. What this was, and not to give the wrong impression, married men were able to have these women on the sides, their concubines. However, their wife was never to know about it. They were never supposed to speak about it in public. And essentially, you never mixed or had the concubine mix with or associate with your wife. It was something that men did on the sly in the background, and it was a sort of culturally accepted thing among men, but it was not accepted for people to talk about it. It was the unspoken rule. Lastly, New Orleans, under the influences of the Creoles, more closely resembled a southern European city than an American city. It earned the reputation as the sinful city. So New Orleans was a unique place. Instead of really considering itself an American city, it did its best to imitate European lifestyles and European ideas. Because of that, it was kind of given this nickname, right, of the sinful city. Taking a look at your reflection question. Look again at the header for this section. All of this information is about whom? As a follow-up question, can you say that Edna Pontellier and Kate Chopin are the same? What can you say about them? Pause the audio here and take some time to respond to these questions before resuming the audio and moving forward. All right. Section 4, the different settings. The islands in the city and their effects. The islands. Grand Isle is an island 50 miles south of New Orleans, between the Gulf of Mexico and Caminada Bay. If you take a look on the Google Slides presentation, you'll see a Google map with a pin drop. Grand Isle had a celebrated Creole resort at the end of the 19th century. It allowed the Creoles to escape the overcrowded, loud, dirty conditions of New Orleans. Chinnery Caminada is basically just a fancy name that they gave to the beach area that existed here on Grand Isle. So the islands are the first setting that you're introduced to in the book. Another setting that you get introduced to is New Orleans in the book, right, where Kate Chopin moved to with her husband, if you recall from earlier. But it's also where Edna lives with her husband, Léonce Pontellier. Another setting in the book is Kentucky. You're not actually taken there, but there are some flashbacks that kind of describe it. And we talked about that Kentucky Presbyterian environment. This is where Edna was born. However, this is also a similar environment to Kate Chopin's upbringing, because St. Louis was a lot like Kentucky in the sense that there were a lot of Presbyterians, in that you do the work first before you're supposed to enjoy things later. Lastly, this novel is what's called a local flavor or a local color novel. It capitalizes on trying to describe the places and the setting is important to understanding it. It's very important for a reader to visualize some of the places in order to really understand what the characters are going through, etc. It's also one of those novels that if you were from that area and you read it, you would instantly pick up on the novel's authenticity, whether the author did or did not get certain aspects about the food, the colors, the dresses, the environments, the way the buildings looked, etc. Lastly, if you take a look at section 5, there's a lot of French vocabulary that's used in this book. And I believe that there are footnotes at the bottom of your pages when these come up. But if you wanted just one place to kind of go to for some of the, to reference, right, you have this resource here, which goes over all of them. But again, there should be some things in your footnotes in the novel as you read through.